I signed up for a Buddhist counseling course in my last semester of divinity school. On the first day of class, the wonderful Professor Chris Berlin asked us, "Can you accept that there is suffering in the world and you can't do anything about it?" I had to answer no. I wasn't there that day. And didn't Judaism teach that we can always do something? We Jews believe in action. I believe, in responsibility. Just because a task is hard, it doesn't excuse us from trying. It is not your duty to complete the work, said Rabbi Tarfon some 1900 years ago, but neither are you free to shirk it. Isn't that what's enabled our people to survive so much adversity? Isn't this our message to the world, that there is always something each of us can do? In the intervening years, I've become a hospital chaplain. I spend a lot of time with suffering people. Many times now, I have had to face a patient who wanted desperately, more than anything else, to get some relief from pain, or a little more time, or to have their leg back. And I've sat with them and with the knowledge both of us shared that I could not grant their deepest wish. If I brightened their day, I did something positive. It was not my duty to complete the work. I certainly could not cure a patient's chronic pain. Another example, I've done chaplaincy work with our unhoused neighbors. Many, many times I've been asked for money. Many, many times it's been within my power to give money, and I didn't do it. Why? I couldn't possibly afford to give money to every client living with extreme poverty, and if I gave money to one client, hundreds would quickly be banging down my door. My budget is finite, and it isn't in my power to assuage human suffering of this enormity. I can sit with people. I can listen to them and try to make their day a little brighter, but even that hardly scratches the surface of the problem. We encounter our mortality several times in our lives before we begin to contemplate our own death. For many of us, our first encounter with mortality comes in the cruel limit on the number of hours in the day. Young with dreams, carried away by pleasant reveries of ambitions, we imagine, many of us, that we can do all we'd like to do, but we find to our dismay that we can't. Our time on earth is limited. We can only do so much in one lifetime, but before we consider that, many of us have had to confront the reality that we can only do so much in one day. We cannot complete all the time-sensitive tasks that are before us. We must choose what we want over what we do not want. We must choose because we are limited, because we are mortal. And that limitation, for many of us, is our first encounter with our mortality. Another encounter with our mortality is realizing the limits of our power. We are limited beings. I don't have the power to solve the problem of hunger in San Francisco and Oakland. There are a lot of people with more power than I have, and of those people, a few really would like to solve the problem of hunger in San Francisco and Oakland, and yet the problem remains unsolved. A billionaire has significantly more power than I have to solve that problem, but even $1 billion will not solve it. And these are just two cities in one relatively progressive state. When you take a step back and consider the problem of global poverty, it is far beyond the power of any person to solve. Yes, we can do something, and we must. We can sit with a cancer patient. We can give a few dollars. We can organize, and we must. But we are limited in our power. There is suffering that we cannot assuage. It is not our duty to complete the work. Neither are we free to shirk it, but we need to understand that part of taking responsibility for what part of this work we can do is recognizing the enormity of the work that we cannot do. We will be no use to the organizing movement that must now rise if we burn ourselves out before we've even started. The times we're entering will call for discipline and realism, for a commitment to the truth in the face of forces that want to blur it. If we are to help at all, we must come to terms with our mortality, with our limitations, the more clearly to see what we can and must do with the time and ability we have. Moses encounters his mortality in our Torah reading this week. After reciting a rather severe poem about the Israelites' relationship with God, Moses hears the news that he will not enter the promised land with the people. He is to ascend a nearby mountain and die there, relinquishing leadership to his protege Joshua. Various reasons are given for this. God says in this portion that it's because Moses failed to glorify God at the waters of Merivat Kadesh in the wilderness of Tzin. when God commanded Moses to speak to the rock and tell it to bring forth water, but Moses struck the rock instead. Perhaps more importantly, Moses in his anger made it look as if he himself was doing magic. He failed to attribute the miracle to God when speaking before the people. Whatever the reason, Moses is not to enter the land. Moses is human, imperfect, mortal. And there comes a time, just from the reason of his humanness, when he must relinquish control. Moses, who has taken care of this people for over 40 years, can do so no longer. In the next Torah portion, Moses dies. Sorry for the spoiler. But this portion is where he comes face to face with his mortality, finally, and for the first time. There is suffering in the world that even Moses cannot assuage. We can confront our limitations earlier in our lives than Moses did by understanding the limits of our power, and we must, for only by understanding the limits of our power, our mortality, our humanness, can we wisely take responsibility for exercising the power that we do have. And only by squarely confronting our limitations can we fully understand the urgency of working together, of building a movement that will outlast any of us. That, attested by the fact that we Jews are still here, is precisely the wisdom of the Torah, and our times demand we pay attention. Our society is poised to take giant steps backward, to turn the clock back 100 years. Millions of people stand to lose basic human rights in a matter of months. Millions more have already lost them, or never had them, and things are going to get even worse for them than they've been in at least half a century. Roe v. Wade will be gutted or reversed. Voting rights will be curtailed. Overt white supremacism is back, and anti-Semitism with it. Bigots are increasingly saying the quiet part out loud. White supremacist police literally get away with murder, and the oceans are steadily rising. We must prepare, and we will have to stick together. I'm afraid we are entering a time of great unrest and trouble. Those of us who are of good hearts and a certain amount of privilege have become accustomed to the idea that we can change the world. This is not false, although it must be complicated now by a double dose of reality. First, if we were able to change the world, does the fact that white supremacist police still get away with murder, and the fact that brown children still languish their childhoods away in 55-degree cages, not reflect somewhat on us? Second, no amount of marches with handmade signs, no amount of generous checks written, no amount of volunteering will assuage the scale of human misery that I'm afraid we're about to see before us, wrought by the reactionary forces at work in this country. The time has come and gone when marching was a safe activity, undertaken by religious schools with little more than a permission slip. The time has come and gone when serious misery was something to write a check to, not something to look out your window at. The time has come and gone when these problems were small enough, or looked small enough, to solve in our lifetimes. We are all much more at risk now in the face of enormous social evil. Privilege will not serve to insulate us the way it used to, and it is not within our power to complete this work, either individually or as a group. We will have to get used to there being suffering in the world, in our world, that we cannot do anything about. Don't get me wrong, I'm an optimist. Gen Z has all the right views. I believe this wave of bigotry is the last gasp of an old bigoted America, legacy of slavery and genocide, a culture not capable of living up to its professed ideals because of the still looming shadow of its evil past, that is destined to give way to something different and better, something that the future will build. That new promised land might very well still be called America, but it will have truly done the work to confront its white, cis, male, Christian supremacist past, and a society will emerge based on better assumptions about what it means to be good. I believe this society will get there on this land, but until then, it's going to be a pretty big last gasp of an entrenched old evil, and we, like Moses, will probably not live to see that promised land. When the Piaseczner Rebbe, the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, first confronted the enormity of the horror of the Holocaust, his first reaction was to say the Jewish community needed to redouble their repentance and redouble their prayer. By Rosh Hashanah 1942, the Piaseczner Rebbe had something different to say. He didn't know what was going on. He knew that it was far beyond anything his community could possibly be to blame for. Similarly here, we personally are not to blame for this. We could always have done more. We could always have done better, but what is about to happen is not the consequence of our failings or imperfections, and we will burn ourselves out if we try to solve the whole thing. But the future depends on us. It is not our duty to complete this work, but neither are we free to shirk it. How can we effectively take responsibility for a work we as mortal human beings cannot complete? When the Hasidic Jews of Lublin of the Piaseczner Rebbe's generation sang "Wir werden sie überleben," we will outlive them, they were not talking about their own mortal lives, which they were about to lose to Nazi murderers. They were talking about something larger, and they put the very genius of the Torah into 4 Yiddish words: we will outlive them. Even though we ourselves probably will not see the promised land for which we strive. When we contribute to the mission of our people to sow the seeds of a better society, we participate in eternity and we enact the central truth of hope with which all Torah is impregnated. Wir werden sie überleben. We will outlive them. We participate in God's plan of the ultimate triumph of good when, understanding the scope of our human limitations, we take responsibility for what we can do. We must stick together. We must look out for each other as our safety, such as it ever was, evaporates. We must create, just among ourselves if necessary, a better society that follows a better vision, a vision of the infinite intrinsic worth of each person and of our common human rights, and we must expand that society bit by bit. We are human, and if we act human in an inhuman situation, that is enough. That is already a lot. Let us build something better, starting right here. Won't you join me? Wir werden sie überleben, überleben. Wir werden sie überleben, überleben. Wir werden sie überleben, überleben. Wir werden sie